Hey everyone, thanks for joining the Bible Uncensored, the place where the outcasts, the misfits, the unwelcomed can get real and raw with the Bible. Welcome home. This week, we're going to look at the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. We're finally getting into the actual books of the Bible. This one is we're going to look at the theme of the book of Matthew. We're going to look at who he is as a person and kind of his history and the people that he's writing to and their culture and their history and also the people and the stories that are involved here and their society and the culture involved with that. So let's get into it. First, we need to kind of talk about what it even looks like that there are four gospels here. See, gospel means good news. And so the gospel according to Matthew is the good news according to Matthew. Matthew is one of the 12 disciples of Jesus that he originally called. So he actually walked with this guy and is writing a personal account, a memory of this Jesus person. Now, when I look at the four gospels, some people will kind of get upset about it and say, well, they contradict each other. And that's really not true if we look at what's going on here. Remember, these are separate books. These are separate stories pertaining to the same thing. It's one coherent story being woven through all these separate books. And so I look at the gospels as like blog posts. Now, let's imagine, if you will, that we go to Coachella and we see the Tupac hologram happening. And so we all come out of this as individuals. Now, let's say that one of us is an audiovisual technician. Let's say that it's a sound engineer. One of us is a sound engineer. One of us is a artist, promoter, and manager. One of us is just a regular attendee, and one of us is a musician, an artist themselves. Now, all four of these people go to the same event. They experience the same thing, but all four of these people, when they go to write their separate blog accounts, are going to have certain things that they talk about. I would imagine the sound engineer would discuss how it sounded as if Tupac himself was there on stage with the microphone, even though it was a hologram, and all that meant, and how wild the technology is that they can even do this and make it seem like a real live event. I would imagine that the artist, promoter, and manager would look at this thing and talk about how much work it took to get everything set into motion and in perfect place, and all the background issues that go in with that, and how they had to pay the certain way to use the rights of Tupac, and all this kind of stuff that would happen with that, about all the marketing and everything that went into getting this event to happen, and how amazing that was. And I would see probably the person that's just attending would say that it almost just seemed like magic, how the sound just worked and how the lights worked and how the actual hologram itself really looked like Tupac. And then I would imagine that they would talk about the energy of the crowd and how it all seemed like we were in this one thing and all this stuff together. And I would imagine further that the artist, the fourth person here, the musician, would approach this and talk about the technical side on what it's like to be a performer, how it even seemed like this Tupac hologram was a real live performer at this music event. And so we would get four different stories about the same exact event. This is what's happening with the Gospels, that we see these four stories, these four accounts, these blog posts that are telling of the same thing, but in their own personal bias is a word that you might use, their filter. When you write a blog, you kind of have a purpose to it. You don't just sit down and kind of just spill out your thoughts. Usually you would say, I'm going to write about art and beauty, or I'm going to write about what it's like to be a single mom, or any of these things. And so every story that you share has a theme that runs through it. It's the same thing with the Gospels. And Matthew's gospel, his blog, is about the king and the kingdom. Matthew is going to share with us all these stories that make sure that by the time we finish his blog, that we understand that Jesus is the king and that this is all about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. Now, Matthew was a tax collector. He was called by Jesus. We We know this because it tells us this in Matthew 9, verses 9 through 19, Mark 2, verses 14 through 17, and Luke 5, verses 27 through 32. This is where Jesus is leaving the temple. He passes by a tax collector's booth, sees a man named Matthew, says, "Follow me." Matthew leaves everything, drops all of the money bags, and chases after Jesus. Remember the couple weeks ago when we talked about how a rabbi would call his followers, he would say, "Follow me." And that meant that he's calling them into that final stage of school. This was such a great honor. And we'll see why that's such a great honor for Matthew here in a second. But Matthew then throws a party for Jesus in his own house with all these other tax collectors and sinners and the Pharisees and all these really religious leaders and righteous people. They get angry at Jesus because he's hanging out with the wrong people. You don't hang out with these guys. And Jesus says, it's for these very people that I came. You see, the doctor doesn't come for the healthy. He comes for the sick. You don't look for something that's found. You look for that which is lost, to seek and save that which is lost. And so we see that this is the calling later on in the book. 9 chapters in is when Matthew is finally called. And so we have some work to do here to figure out why this is actually important. You see, the job tax collector that Matthew performed it's not just like an IRS tax collector that we have here in America, and we think, oh, a tax man, he's just going to take his money. No. This is during Roman imperial rule. The Jews are under the empire of Rome, and so there's soldiers walking around that keep them enslaved. This is actually an enslavement. It's a very free enslavement, but it's an enslavement nonetheless. You see, the Romans, they would come into a region and they would say either bend the knee, bow and submit to us, or we can submit you. We can bring peace. There's a term called Pax Romana, and it's generally applied to the period of time where there was no war in the Roman Empire, but that's pretty much because they conquered everybody. So it wasn't that all of a sudden there was peace because everything was all goodwill and awesome. There was peace because there was nobody left to fight, because they would just squash everybody. See, the Romans, they would actually send an emissary, an ambassador of sorts, to a region and say, "Good news, Pax Romana is coming to you." And the people of that city would be like, "Oh shit," because that means either we have to give up everything, lay it all down, lay our swords and spears and shields and everything out of the city, and just stay inside, be like, "Look, we're not fighting. Let's lay. Hey, look, we're good. Wave the white flag, show that we're not going to be any trouble, and then we can have peace." And they're probably still going to take some of your men and probably kill one or two of them so they can set an example. Because that's just what they do. They need you to see that they're very serious. Or the news that the Roman peace is coming to you would be a sign of war. And so you would get all your men that could fight and all your weapons, and you would try to stave off this attack. And it never really worked. And so you would be destroyed. And then peace would be had because they had killed everybody that could fight, and they would take all your women and your children, and it's very bad news. And so once they began to rule an area, they had to raise the taxes to stay in the area. So you were paying taxes to the people that just came and took your entire way of life from you, so they could stay there and make sure that you don't revolt. And that's what a tax collector is. You see, a tax collector is a local person taking money from their friends and family and giving it to the Romans to make sure that these soldiers that are essentially like terrorists could stay here and keep them in slavery. You can imagine then that no one would like a tax collector. They were probably not many friends to be had if you were one. And so these tax collectors, they're isolated, and they're not really that popular. Everyone knows who they are, but no one really likes them at all, because they pay the people that killed your husband or your son or have raped your daughter or your wife or your sister, and they take your money, and they just come in and go, "Well, this harvest is ours now, and there's nothing you can do about it." I mean, this is insanity. And so your neighbor starts taking money from you to give to these people so they can stay. You would not call him a friend. That's who Matthew is. He's a local that's a traitor. Worse than that, he's keeping you enslaved. And that's why I find it interesting here that he has a Greek name and a Hebrew name. That as a Hebrew boy, Levi, Matthew, would have been raised through the school system that we talked about a few weeks ago, that he would have gone to school from about 5 to 8-ish, and then up to around 13, and then up to around 18. And so we see that this school system keeps going, and more than likely he made it to 13 and didn't proceed any further. And in the region that he's from, which is the region Galilee, it's a very, very, very poor region. You see these taxes that are incited on the people by Rome, they were around 90%. That means for every dollar that they made, 90 cents of that went to Rome. You have 10 cents now to operate, and they weren't paid much. These are farmers. These are fishermen. These are carpenters. These are skills trade workers. They're not engineers and CEOs. They're blue collar workers, and they're taxed at 90%. And then if they talk back against it, they're thrown in jail. On the way to work, these soldiers would come by and say, "Carry my pack," and they'd walk you a mile away from where you're going. It's just ridiculous. It was display of power simply because they could. And so Matthew is a Hebrew. He's a Jew that went through the Jewish schools up till probably around age 13. At that point, the rabbi would have told him, go and learn the family trade, and most likely the family is very poor, and he saw an opportunity to collect taxes, and so got into this business. And so he goes into a school of the Greeks to learn how to do the Roman system. The Romans would have then taught them how to do their way of math and how to do their way of accounting, so that they can take the taxes and give it properly to the Roman governance. Well, this would make you at odds, because when you are Hebrew and you give in to the Greeks, you're a Hellenistic Jew, and you are less Jew than those that are not Hellenistic. And so you're already in a religious tension here because you've gone to the other side. But once you go to the Greek school, you're a Jew. You're not a Greek. You're not a Roman. So now you're looked at poorly by your fellow people, by your own ethnic group. And then you go to this new place and you're looked at poorly because you come from that ethnic group. And so you're hated by both sides here. There's no winning. And so you can see how it kind of begins to callous you, that these people that are the empire and has come against you and crushed your people are now your place of employment, but you hate them, but you found a way to make a better life for yourself. That's tax collecting. Because as a tax collector, you can make up any rule that you want to say, oh, this is the new tax. And so the tax collectors would overcollect. They would overcharge the people, and they would give to Rome whatever Rome asked for, and then they would keep the rest. And so these tax collectors were becoming very, very wealthy. And the people hated them even more because they knew they're getting ripped off. It's just kind of hard to prove it. And the Romans didn't care. They're getting all their money. So what should they care that somebody is ripping them off and doing it? That's your own problem. Deal with it your own self. And so they're not good people. They're not liked. They're not accepted in society. And so it's just very interesting here. You have the Hebrew name Levi, which would have been what he was raised by, and then a Greek name that he would have associated himself with that means gift of God. I just can't help but maybe he gave it to himself. Maybe Jesus gave it to him like Jesus did to Peter. I don't know. I just find it interesting that this name means gift of God, that his name used to mean Levi, used to mean joined and attached. And then this is a man that's disjointed and not attached at all. And so he's like, I don't even know who I am. And I can imagine if it's himself giving him this name, that he's kind of gotten this new arrogance and says, well, I'm the gift of God. I'm Matthew. Or maybe it's Jesus and his tenderness that says, you're Matthew, you're a gift. Everybody else may think that you're some asshole, but I think that you're a true gift. And so as we look at who Matthew is and the culture here, remember these are fishermen. And so there's a lot of things going on. The region of Galilee had the Decapolis, this 10 cities. It's a very prominent area of the Greeks, of the Romans here, very rich and wealthy. And then you have the poor Israelites, the Jews. And so they're at these odds. It's like being in a city where on one part of it, there's extreme affluence, and then right across the street is extreme poverty, and no one's helping each other. Because you're so different. There's so much racism going on. It's unreal. So much religious extremism, and so there's so much to unpack with all that's happening here with this person, Matthew, and who he's writing to. Matthew more than likely would have been in his 20s when he was called by Jesus, because he would have been through the early schooling like the Hebrews and the Greek schooling for the tax collectors. So he's probably between 18 and I'd say 25. He's rather young. He's a young man. He's probably one of the oldest disciples. As we move through the Gospels, we're going to be seeing this. We know that he's around his 20s because when Jesus calls him, he's old enough to have been the tax collector, to have graduated. So Matthew would have learned the Greek language and the Greek culture, and he would have learned the Aramaic, which was the language being spoken from his people, and the Hebrew. He's a very educated person. He's not a stupid person, even though he comes from a simple place. He's very, 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 very smart, very well learned. This is going to further separate him from the people that he lives with because these are simple people. I'm not saying that to say that they're stupid. I mean that they are dedicated to their jobs. Again, skills trade. I come from a skills trade family. You learn your task and you learn it well, and you do that thing. And there's not much room usually for people to go out and learn new things. So it's going to further separate him from the rest of the people there. He's hated by both sides, both Jews and Greeks. And when Jesus, the rabbi, comes walking by and says, "Follow me," he's saying this to a man that was given up on by society and has given up on society. Jesus is a rabbi. He carries the authority of the whole Jewish religion and culture. And he says to him, "Follow me. I think you can do what I do. I see in you a teacher. I see in you someone who's religiously pure and able to learn the truths and mysteries of God and share them with other people." And he sees a hope in Matthew that he wants to call out. And so it had been so incredibly offensive to everybody around, because Jesus is supposed to be this teacher of God and of God's people, and yet he's calling the tax collector. And I can imagine people stopping and going, "Oh, no, hold on. You don't know who that is. He's a tax collector. Jesus, you must have had a mistake in your thoughts here. You obviously don't want him. He's the reason why your brothers and your cousins and your mom and everybody is taxed. He's the reason why we have these things. In fact, in just 3.5 years, Jesus, he's the reason why the Roman soldiers can take you and crucify you. You don't want a tax collector." But Jesus calls him and says, I want you. And so Matthew writes this gospel as someone who's never belonged, someone who was regarded as a horrible sinner, as a traitor to his people, and ultimately someone who found acceptance, someone who found identity, forgiveness, and purpose in this person, Jesus. He writes to the Jewish people to declare that Jesus is king, not Caesar. That it's Jesus. That Jesus has zero regard for the politics and religion of man. That Jesus really came to set the captives free, and that meant everyone, not just the Jews. See, this is something that's going to piss off a lot of Jews, because they think that they are God's holy chosen people and that everyone else are these sinners, these Gentiles, these vile things that can't be forgiven. Yet they were supposed to be. Remember, we looked at that a couple weeks ago. They were supposed to go up the mountain, receive this covenant from God to become priests and prophets and reconcile the entire world. And so Matthew understands that. Matthew's looking at this and saying, Jesus is the king, not just of the Jews. He's the king of the world. This kingdom is the kingdom of the heavens, as the Greek language says. The Greek, it's not just the kingdom of heaven, it's the kingdom of the heavens, because the Jews have this idea of at least 3 heavens. There is the earthly heaven here, all that we can experience and within pretty much the atmosphere. Then there's the air above us and all that. And then there's the space outside. And so they're saying the entire universe, everything that is, every bit of being, the kingdom is of that. There's nothing that's not within this kingdom of Jesus. And Jesus is the king of it. He records Jesus' lineage through the King David to prove his right to be king. He records Jesus as a patient teacher to those truly seeking, and also harsh to those who seek to control or manipulate others. He records Jesus as empowering those who receive the truth of him, who believe in the truth of Jesus and all that he teaches, and then he commissions them and empowers them to go and do the same. Matthew is I come from like the punk rock subculture, and it's born out of this folk culture as well, that we've never belonged. We've never really fit in, and we look at things and kind of see like, how can we stir things up? Because I don't have to do it the way that you do it. We can do it our own. We don't need you. I see Matthew as being like super punk, where he's looking at the Greeks and he's saying, you think Caesar is king? Jesus is king. He looks at the Jews and says, you think Jesus is only the king of you, that you're an ethnic group better than any others? Jesus is king of everyone, baby, not just the Jews. He says, you think Jesus is just the king of Israel? No, I'm telling you, not even just of the whole world. He's king of everything. His kingdom is of the heavens. Matthew is writing this to signify that the politics and religion are done. It's what he's talking about when it's that Jesus has no regard. He sees the politics of within the Jews themselves and of Rome and says, I'm a king. I have nothing to do with you. He sees the religious setup and he says, I'm the high priest. Nothing to do with you. This thing is better. I'm giving it back to the people. I've really come to set them free. You see, the Romans kept them in bondage by other taxation and holding them down in slavery. So I've come to set free the captives, and the religious leaders have held everybody down by making them pay extra for all their offerings and their sacrifices, and making sure that the people couldn't get closer to God, that they're always wrapped up in needing the religious elite. And Jesus comes and just hands it over to the people. It's no wonder why Jesus gets crucified. Jesus stirs every pot possible. Jesus pisses everybody off in the most amazing of ways. I think as we study through this, we'll see that Jesus is perhaps the most punk rock of all characters in all of history, and Matthew is one of his kind. So the blog that happens here is to prove the kingdom and the king. To prove acceptance and inclusion from somebody that was rejected and excluded. Now, the book Matthew, it's debated about when it was written. Some people think that it was written after 70 AD. They say that Mark was probably the first gospel written around 70 AD, and then Luke and Matthew were modeled after it. They say this because in 70 AD, there's something very specific that happens, and that's the destruction of Jerusalem. The reason why they place this after AD 70 is because there's some prophecies in there that are way too specific to have been before either Jesus and the people that's all being told here, that Jesus is prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem perfectly, that he really had foreknowledge, which if he's God, then of course he did. Either that's the truth and it was written before 70 AD, or Matthew and the other writers of the Gospels are just trying to imply that Jesus knew this and that this was written after 70 AD and it was added in as like, Jesus, of course Jesus would have taught about this. Now, I would hold to believe that it's written before 70 AD, probably between 60 and 70 AD, as a exhortation to the church to remember, as to the Jews, to call them to repentance and say, dude, there's one king. You got to get this. His kingdom is here because there's a real destruction coming, and they really need to know all that's going on. In fact, Matthew's gospel is one of the most clear prophetic descriptions about what's going to happen to Jerusalem. And I see this as a warning saying, come home. So I believe it's written in that period between AD 60 and AD 70 as a warning, as an exhortation, as a prophetic sign that God is not looking for you to be destroyed, but he's looking for you to be redeemed. It's written to people that some of them are believers, but most of this is written to unbelievers. It's to the Jews. It's to the people in Israel. It's like the last ditch effort. It's the Hail Mary at the 5-second mark, trying just to get something in. It's a man that was thrown away by his people, by everybody, that threw everybody else away. It's like the Scrooge story where you're so separated that once you finally experience love, you can't help but try to share it. I see the Gospel of Matthew being written as something that Matthew is saying, please, you don't know what it's like to be on the outside like I do, and I'm telling you, I've been brought in. So come in. I see the Gospel of Matthew as a letter of hope to this people saying, I was once in darkness and now I'm in light. I was once excluded and now I'm included, and this king will bring you in. This is a kingdom of inclusion. This is a kingdom of acceptance. This is a kingdom of forgiveness. All you have to do is accept it. All you have to do is believe. So believe. This book, Matthew, it's called the Gospel according to Matthew. It's the good news. And that good news is that Jesus really is good, that Jesus really did set us free, not just from Roman captivity, but from ourselves, from that disease of sin. He set us free from our own self-abasement, our own self-hatred, our own selfishness and greed. He set us free from us so that we can love, we can experience that divine union and the love that happens, and we can share it and we can accept it and we can enter into that. The good news is that the kingdoms of this world aren't the only ones. There's a kingdom of the heavens that's come. And that king is Jesus. And that king has invited everyone. So once again, as we move through this book of Matthew, I think we're going to find that Jesus, as the express image of God, shows us that God really wants us to join the family, to have a place that we belong to know that we have a worth and a value, and that we are really capable of loving and being loved and giving love. That, as I've said before, maybe God isn't quite as angry as we've thought he was. Maybe the Bible is better than we've ever understood, and maybe we are better than we've ever been led to believe. So once again, welcome home. Hey, thanks again so much for joining the Bible Uncensored. I hope this was informative and it was a blessing to you. Please feel free to share this out with as many people as possible. Subscribe to our channel. Find us and like us on Facebook at The Bible Uncensored. Follow us on Instagram at The Bible Uncensored. And on the Instagram bio section, there's a little Twitter handle that you can follow. Click the link there. You can get us on all of your social media. If you want to support us financially, you can do so by going to patreon.com/The Bible Uncensored. Thanks again. Be blessed.